Hi, everyone. Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. I'm Diane Brady. We are here with Yaqiu Wang, who is Senior China Researcher, Human Rights Watch. Yaqiu, welcome. And we are,
Thank you for having me.
of course, and we are talking about the protests going on right now in China. You've, been tracking this for quite some time. How different is this to some of the other protests we've seen? Is momentum
Well,
shifting?
well, I think first of all, I would say I'm very inspired. I'm thrilled, but at the same time terrified because people are going to the street. They're no longer just say, I wanted the COVID restrictions to be lifted, or I don't want the pollution. I want more pay for my job. People are saying, I want freedom. I want human rights. I want democracy. And I want President Xi Jinping to step down. I want the end of the Communist Party rule. This is, extraordinary. We all know the government has a history of brutally cracking down on people who demand for their rights, for democracy. The most notable example is the 1989 Tiananmen Square
Right,
massacre.
right.
People went to the street and say, we want democracy. Then the government dispatched tanks to roll over people's body.
And of course, we've seen in Hong Kong as well that some of the democracy protests there did not necessarily result in the types of freedoms people were asking for. Is she vulnerable? I mean, there's obviously what the people on the street say, and then there are the people within the Communist Party. He is now basically into his third term. Do you get some sense that this is just these are protests that once again will be put down, or is there an indication that he might actually be vulnerable?
Well, I mean, the Chinese political system is extremely opaque, so we don't know the dynamics within the party. Maybe people around him is unhappy with him already, given, he just claimed a third term for himself and he has been, grabbed more and more power to himself for the past 10 years. But, for people outside the system, we can't really have a view of that. But at the same time, I would say, the government has done a great job in controlling the society, in eliminating any kind of independent voice in the past 10 years through internet censorship, through surveillance. Now there's no any kind of substantive civil society groups that can play a role to organize people to make the movement sustainable. Right now, it's just people who are so frustrated, so angry, so they just went to the street to protest spontaneously. But in order for any kind of movement to sustain, you need some kind of organizing ability, some kind of organizing infrastructure there. But in China, that's not possible.
One of the things that's been very interesting is to see the relationship between the U.S. and China. And right now, there's certainly a lot of focus on Washington in terms of the regulatory front, whether it's getting Chinese companies to open up their books. There was a decision about telecom equipment with Huawei and various peers, and of course TikTok and ByteDance, and this sense that to be a company based in China is to be a company that cannot be trusted in the U.S. Some have felt that's almost xenophobic. That's certainly what TikTok says. What do you feel in terms of what you know about the companies and the degree of censorship and the degree to which a lot of information is shared with the government? Are U.S. regulators right to be concerned in your mind about companies that are big players in China coming here to the U.S., knowing what you know?
Well, I'm sure, there are xenophobia in the US, there nationalism and people don't, like China because it's China, right? And there are anti-Chinese, anti-Asia racism in the US. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that all Chinese companies, whether they are private or state-owned, they are beholden to the Chinese government. So if the Chinese government wants them to censor, if the Chinese government wants them to survey, they have to do it. They have no choices to not do it. So this is also a fact. So I think the concern about TikTok's data collection practices, TikTok's surveillance and censorship practices are completely legitimate.
So, do you feel like obviously part of what precipitated the current demonstrations was, a fire with a devastating death toll, in a sense that was partly a result of lockdown. We've talked a lot about how cultures have changed throughout the pandemic, certainly here in the U.S. Do you get the sense that there is that level of change, or are we likely to see the kinds of crackdowns you mentioned in the past around protests of any form, whether it's, the Uyghurs or going all the way back to Tiananmen Square? What do you anticipate this time? Is there any sense that the voice of the people is going to make a difference?
Well, I think, people have been protesting on each because of issues concerning pollution, labor rights violations, women's rights. But this time, I think people are really connecting the COVID restrictions with the political system. China was successful in containing the virus at the beginning of the pandemic, but now this similar measures are being instituted at a time that the broader context has changed. Omicron isn't as threatening as the previous variants, and this zero COVID policy is still being carried out in an abusive way that is not based on science. People know why we're still having these policies, because the political system. This one man in Beijing decides the entire country should be under this sort of restrictions. It's because we don't have a democratic process. We don't have, people's opinions and how they feel about the policies are not factored into the government's decision making. And also the experts' opinions are not factored into the government's decision making. And this is a flaw of this political system. So people are connecting dots. So I think this does feel different. Also, the zero COVID policy affects everyone in China.
Yeah.
In the past, the protests are usually limited to a certain location, but now, this protests are across the country.
One other question I had, Yaqiu, is that you alluded to Deng Xiaoping and of course, the Tiananmen Square. I'd love to put Xi Jinping in the context of how different a leader he is for China right now relative to the many other leaders that we've seen, maybe not many other, but the leaders that we've seen up to that point. We've heard about the Uyghurs, in Western China, the Muslim minority. How much more restrictive is it now than it was, even a decade plus ago? Just to give some context for those who don't track it as closely as you do.
Well, I think, when the internet was introduced to China and people felt, the internet was going to change the country. But the government has perfected the censorship. And right now, people can enjoy the entertainment on the internet. The internet provides, as people in the U.S. do. But at the same time, they don't get the information we do here get. And also, the government also utilized the internet to do better own propaganda.
Yeah.
Besides that, I think one big thing that has really changed is the government's surveillance capabilities. 10 years ago, the government, no governments have the technology to survey people the way, today governments can do. And China is at the very forefront of government surveillance. So I think those things really, empowered the government to control people even more so than 10 years ago or 40 years ago. And again, and the second part is that the global context has changed. 40 years ago, China was a relatively small country in the economic sense, but now China is the world's second largest economy, and there's a different level of confidence. Deng Xiaoping was about opening to the West, learn from the West, but now I don't think Xi Jinping feels that there's anything to learn from the West.
So you are not optimistic, I take it. Do you feel safe going back yourself? I mean,
Well, I have a Chinese passport, so I mean it's my legal right, right? So, but I know, there are, um, things would deter me from going back to China, and I wouldn't want to go into details, but I'm very cautious of the risks.
and any other advice you give as to how to assess what's going on right now? Because it does feel more widespread. We're hearing language we have not heard before here in the West with regard to very personal language about Xi Jinping. Do you think that this could mark a turning point, or do you really feel this too shall pass from what you've seen?
I don't know. I mean, this is so personal to me, and I feel, I really feel so inspired by people because it's really risky to go out to the street just say, Xi Jinping down, right? And I really want to see people's rights to be respected and people win after paying such a price. But at the same time, I understand that the system's control over the Chinese society is very solid, and they have the tools and they have the technologies and also the militaries to control the country. So I don't know. I think I want to say is that I support our young people's demand and whatever they decided to do to have their rights respected.
So watch not just the protest, but the reaction and the consequences of it. So thank you very much, Yaqiu. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.